Welcome back to this 15th lecture of our Crash Course Economy series, and in this video we'll be discussing about the industry and infrastructure chapter from Economic Survey and the related basics. What is the context of this chapter? When we were discussing about the sectors of economy, we talked about three sectors, namely primary, secondary and tertiary. If we are supposed to talk about the contribution, that is the gross value added, if you know the basics of the difference between GVA and GDP, which we have discussed in previous chapters also briefly, please post in the comment section below what is the difference between GVA and GDP. Now, when we're talking about GVA, broadly these are the numerical trends associated with different sectors of economy. And when we're talking about the secondary sector, we are talking about industry only. So the usual structural problem of Indian economy is that more than 45 to 50% of the population depends on agriculture, and it is not that remunerative. So other sectors of economy should provide employment. Services sector is heavily reliant on skills, and in a country where a significant population do not have that kind of skill levels, industrialization is the way forward according to a lot of economic policy makers. So industry can support a lot of new jobs. Therefore, Make in India has been the flagship program from government from 2014. Now, anyway, coming back, in this chapter we will be studying about what constitutes industry, what is the performance of industry, and how to make it more remunerative for Indian economy. Technically, when we say industry, there are certain components associated with that as well. What are the components? Here are the components. You can download it and have a look. The important point to note is within what constitutes industry, manufacturing is having the highest weightage or contribution. We will be discussing elaborately in the next table. When we say industry, these are the four components that we deal with: mining and quarrying, manufacturing, electricity, gas, water supply, and other utility services, construction industry. So these four segments constitute the components of industry. So when you mean industry, these are the four categories that you should be thinking about. And if you want to track the performance of industry, these four segments growth can be tracked, and we can say whether industry performed well in a particular year or not. Regarding the performance of industry across different time periods, you will notice that there is one sector which has withstood even the crash of economy during the COVID crisis. That is electricity, gas, water supply, and other utility services. You can see here. Why did that happen? Because even if it is a lockdown, that did not stop the economy from producing electricity and other basic essential services. So if you have a question on which component of industry has withstood the shocks given by COVID, it is this. But remember, manufacturing contributes highest to the gross value added from industry's perspective. There are two metrics to measure how industry performed, and economic survey talks about the index of industrial production and the index of 8 core industries. So how do we measure this? Imagine a basket of goods, and in this basket you will be measuring, let's say, some amount of X quantity is produced by the industry. You measure that in a base year, let's say 2019 2020. In the next year, if we measure, we'll notice that there is 1.2x. So this increase is nothing but an increase in the performance of industry. This is how broadly we will be measuring the performance of industry. But in a practical economy, you will notice that not all the things that an industry produces is equally important. So certain industries are given weightage according to the need and the demand in an economy. Therefore, manufacturing occupies highest amount of weightage in this industry's tracking performance, followed by mining, and therefore finally electricity. You might be wondering that industry also constitutes other components. There are four components discussed, but the data availability for the other components is difficult, so we'll be just tracking these three broad categories only. This is one way to track the performance of industry. Another way is if we actually track the core industries, which defines the trajectory of a industry for a particular year, and extrapolate that, even that would be a good metric. So we'll be focusing our energy on 8 core industries with these respective weights, which together constitutes 40.27 percentage of the total industry. So the respective weights are given here, and a lot of questions were previously asked from 8 core industries and the weightage they have. Note that refinery products have the highest weightage and fertilizer has the least weightage. You can download the document and read it later. So this is how they measure the performance of industry. Naturally, after the lockdown, the performance of industry has definitely grown much better, but it is yet to recover and attain the pre-pandemic levels. This is the conclusion of the survey. Two more definitions that can be asked in prelims examination you have to know. They are also performance indicators for our industry. One is the capacity utilization, and the other one is RBI's manufacturing index and business expectation index. So these two performance indicators are also tracked to see how our industry perform. Now, what do you mean by capacity utilization? Simply put, it means we might be having a capacity to produce 100 kgs, but because of lockdown and lack of demand, we are just producing 40 kgs. This is the capacity utilization ratio, the actual, that is 40 by potential 100. We are just at 40%. It shows how much potential we have and why we are not able to reach that optimum level. And the second one is actually a survey conducted by RBI from different stakeholders of an economy, and understand how they feel that the business going forward would be like. This is also considered by economic survey to track the performance of our industry. It is not important to go into the details of this, just know that this survey is conducted by RBI. When we talk about the GDP growth, gross fixed capital formation, or I, the component I, is very important for industrial growth as well. If we take a look at the historical trends, 2007 is the year where we have peaked with respect to our investments, and after that it has been a downhill, except for a brief period between 2015 and 2018. After that, again, the investment has been falling, and this is not an issue which is because of the COVID. This is a pre-COVID issue. There are certain structural issues in our economy pertaining to the ease of doing business. So the Atmanirbhar package, which was supposed to, make things easier for the businesses, is a strategy to address these structural issues and increase the gross fixed capital formation, which we might be witnessing in the upcoming years. So, what is the trend that economic survey says? Actually, the gross fixed capital formation has slightly fallen. And the next metric which talks about the growth of industry is the amount of credit that companies are willing to take to expand. So, if we take a look in 2020, it is actually minus 0.7, quite understandable because there is absolutely no business because of the strict first lockdown. And in the second wave, even though it was much more severe than the first wave, companies actually took more loans, and there is highest growth witnessed in this rubber plastic industry. And if we talk about the volume of loans, large companies followed by micro and small and medium companies took the credit in the particular order. This can be a question in your prelims examination. The next thing is about FDI. FDI is foreign direct investment. We have elaborately talked about what FDI is. So how does it come into a country? Either through government's control or automatic route. That is, you do not require government's approval. So if you take a look at the trends of FDI in the past 2 decades, 60% came in the last 7 years. And what is it that the government has done? Basically, they have liberalized this automatic route even further and more sectors were opened up. Economic survey talks about certain measures that were taken to allow greater foreign participation, especially in the four sectors. Since it is mentioned in the survey, you have to remember this. Defense and insurance sector, now it is 74%, and petroleum and natural gas exploration as well as the telecom sector, the FDI sectoral limit has been increased to 100%. Another important thing that we have to note is in 2020, just before the first lockdown, government noticed that China has been going around the world since because of the lockdown and surge in COVID, prices were falling down. But fundamentally, there are some very good businesses like the systematically important bank HDFC. China's central bank has actually acquired 1.1% of HDFC, which is a very dangerous thing. If this trend continues and if they continue to acquire 10% of the stake in a such a important sector, they will rule the economy in different ways. So it is important not to let go of certain sectors and hold that strategic advantage. So here is where we have to look at this particular measure taken by the government of India. It said that instead of directly attacking China, we can't actually go and target China because this is against WTO rules. So India came up with a rule that if FDI is coming from any countries which are bordering India, that is, if they are sharing a land border with India, then it should comply with the government route irrespective of the sector. So automatic route is not taken in this particular case, just to keep a watch on such kind of hostile and opportunistic takeovers. Other steps include the creation of FDI monitoring cell to understand if there are any issues in closing the application processes for FDI, and also there is the creation of a standard operating protocol for improving the ease of processing FDI proposals. Another topic which we have already discussed in the first video briefly is about the new public sector enterprises policy of 2021, which talks about minimum government, maximum governance. So government came up with a classification, strategic and non-strategic. All the non-strategic industries or the non-strategic sectors are supposed to be either sold off or privatized. They should be shut down if they are not making profits, except four sectors which were reserved for the strategic because they hold significant importance for the growth of our country and national security. Those include national security, critical infrastructure, energy and minerals, financial services. So these are the respective industries which come under these broad categories, which are not left for privatization. Another important metric to talk about when we are talking about the industry is the corporate performance. So we have noticed by using one metric called net profit per sale, which basically means for every 100 rupees sold, for example, what is the amount of profit that you have. Let's say if 100 rupees is the total sale that is generated, out of this, if 30 rupees is the profit, how is it increasing over a period of time? If 100 rupees is the product or the sale in one particular year and the profit generated is 70 rupees, we can definitely say that corporate performance is actually increasing because people are willing to pay more and give more profits to the corporates because they're seeing some value. So despite the pandemic in the second wave, what economic survey notes is companies were resilient to COVID shock because profits generated per rupee sale is much higher than what it was previously. From a long time, the Indian government's aspiration has been to build a very robust electronic industry, given the fact that the entire world is moving towards Industry 4.0 or Industrial Revolution 4.0, which is marked by artificial intelligence, and a strong electronic industry is a prerequisite to create the kind of hardware that would harness this IR 4.0 economy. Now, what is the issue in Indian economy? Lack of infrastructure and a lot of structural issues, like say for example the cost of exports would increase because of the lack of supporting infrastructure, and because the logistics cost is so high, it is nearly 10 to 15%, and If you take the case in other countries, it is hardly around 7 to 8%. Because of all these issues, electronic industry did not take off really. But in 2019, the government recognized that there is a need for a national level policy on electronics and wanted to test this on certain commodities. It started with phones. In 2019, when this PLI scheme was launched just for phones, prior to that, only 20% of the domestic demand was met through manufacturing or assembling within our country. After the launch of the scheme in 2020, it was so successful that 90% of our demand of smartphones was met through manufacturing within our country. This led to the government launching a scheme called SPECS, which is nothing but the schemes for promotion of manufacturing of electronic components and semiconductors, which kind of paved the way for expanding the scope of this PLI for other sectors as well. So now, as of today, we have 13 sectors where this logic of production linked incentives, that is incentivizing make in India products or assembling in India products, has been expanded to 13 sectors. This will obviously lead to job growth, and this is exactly what is depicted in this infographic. Steel is one of the 8 core industries, and India, despite being the second largest producer, lags behind China, which is the major producer, and it produces more than 50% of the world's total steel. Now, keeping this fact in mind, in 2017 we created this national steel policy which aims to increase the per capita finished steel consumption. Just take a look at this world average. It is 212 kgs. India is almost one third of that, and China 523 kgs is the per capita consumption, which shows the sophisticated nature of Chinese infrastructure. Now, what is the issue? Despite being the second largest steel producer, we still import specialty steel, that is high strength steel or high specialty steel, which is used for certain sectors, and PLI scheme is given to the steel sector to address this anomaly. Now, the government wants to focus upon incentivizing those companies which are producing this high quality steel. And this isn't the first step. Previously, companies demanded that government supports their R&D activities, and government under the CSIR laboratories launched this steel research and technology mission for India. Apart from this, there was also the scheme called Mission Purvodaya, which focused upon certain eastern states in northern Andhra Pradesh, where swift capacity addition was focused upon for creating steel clusters. Apart from this, there is also one scheme which was introduced to encourage domestic manufacturing of steel. Now, let's say if the government had a order worth more than 5 lakhs, then the government made it mandatory to prefer specialty steel or high quality steel from domestic producers. Now, what this did was 21,000 crores came to these steel makers in the country from 2017 to 21. Looking at all these results, now the government wants to extend this benefits of PLI to this sector. The next sector that we have to talk about is the coal sector. You know that 55% of India's power demand, it is roughly around 350 gigawatt today. The power demand is only going to increase further. Now, out of this demand for 350 gigawatts, nearly 55% is met through thermal energy only. And within this 55%, 78% of the total power is met through coal sector. One reason why coal sector is preferred is because it is a cheap source of power. That is why solving the problems of coal industry has been a long pending demand, and liberalization of coal sector happened very recently, like during the pandemic in 2020 itself. The first notification for coal block auction happened, coal block allocation. So just these facts would be enough. The next sector is the pharma sector, where India has achieved tremendous growth in the past couple of years, and of course this is because of the trigger, the pandemic. India has been the number 3 biggest country when it comes to trade with respect to pharma sector. we export more than we import, and India has contributed to nearly 20% of the global generic drugs manufacturing. So if you take a look at the FDI inflows just before the pandemic for second wave, 200% was the increase in FDI into India, and this is even further continuing even after 2021 to 53%. I mean, this itself is a huge growth, and based on that, 53% more is definitely a very good sign. Now, when we are talking about pharma sector, the main problem is availability of raw materials. We nearly import more than 70 to 80% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients, that is the bulk drugs which are required for our generic drugs production. The government contemplated that if we actually create a PLI scheme for specifically active pharmaceutical ingredients, that is the raw materials, then it would definitely move towards Atmanirbharta in pharmacy sector or pharmaceutical sector. So this scheme has been launched with that objective. No need to go into the further details of the numbers, etc. The next sector that we can talk about is the textiles sector, which is the biggest employer after agriculture. Now we have to remember, time and again, government has been trying to support the textile sector, but the requirement of the market has been something else, and the initiatives taken by the government are to protect the traditional industries. Let's say, for example, at a global level, if you take a look at the exports, cotton demand is just 25% of the total textile demand. But when you're talking about the man made fibers, it is 75%. But if you take a look at the basket of goods, cotton exports from India constitute 75%, and man made is just 25%, which means that we are not in sync with the market. Therefore, the government decided that we have to move towards a production linked incentive scheme for man made fibers. What do you mean by man made fibers? Synthetic fibers like nylon, polyester, etc. Hence, this PLI scheme to incentivize these companies. Now, we will be talking about the technical textiles. Now, what do you mean by technical textiles? Let us understand. The primary distinctive feature about a technical textile is that it is non aesthetic, but it is specifically focusing on the function. The functional aspect of the technical textiles is what defines it. Now let me give an example to explain this. Let's take car covers, seat covers. Car seat covers is one example, or you can take a look at the aprons that medical workers use. You can also talk about geotextiles to handle the soil erosion issue. You can also talk about various kinds of protective clothing. Specifically put, the function is of primary criteria rather than the look of it. So this is another sector where India hugely depends on imports from US. So the government in this last year's budget decided to come up with a mega investments textile park scheme, where it is considering a hub for all the natural fibers and then augmenting it into a export hub. It also includes technical textiles as well. The good thing about this scheme is even farmers are considered a part of this ecosystem so that they get their due. So that is the good point about this scheme. Now, before all this, you also have to remember one more fact. Jute has been a traditional industry in our country, and therefore to safeguard the ecosystem of this jute companies and farmers, this act has mandated that food grains and sugar, the packaging of these materials beyond a point or beyond a limit should definitely use certain amount of jute packaging and not the plastic packaging. Now the fact that we are moving towards sustainable development and the entire rhetoric around the world is moving towards natural fibers, jute is a very good alternative. So India can revive the demand for jute across the world again. What does economic survey talk about MSMEs? Why are MSMEs really important? For the very fact that they contribute nearly 1/3 of Indian economy, or the value added in an Indian economy is coming from the MSME sector. They have nearly 50% of the share in exports and employ 11 crore people. Definitely this sector is very important. In 2020, when we were talking about MSMEs, The economic survey of that year talked about how MSMEs will remain as dwarfs and reluctant to grow because of the compliance burden, the heavy regulation that is created by the government. In this regard, RBI came up with UK Sinha committee, and that committee studied the problems of MSME. So, based on the studies of various committees like this, during the time of pandemic, the government decided to go for a revision of the very definition of what is known as an MSME sector, or medium, micro, and small industries. So before that, there is a lower level of investment. Now we have moved towards a higher level. So just remember this new definition by downloading this PDF. Another important point mentioned in the economic survey is the definition of MSME sector. Previously, they did not include retail and wholesale traders. Now they are included, and street vendors are also included under this definition. What is the advantage? Priority sector lending can be accessed by the street vendors. What is priority sector lending? We have already discussed that in previous videos. Another important fact is the creation of the champions portal to make it easy for information access by the Ministry of MSME. So it follows something called the hub and spoke model. Different ministries handle different products, and respective ministries will approach MSME as a hub, and MSME through this champions portal will try to resolve the problems of different sectors. So this is how champions portal is going to work, and now we have already introduced the Udyan portal, where it is considered a one-stop destination for registration of your MSMEs. So all these points are important for prelims. Now take a look at this picture. You have this BIS hallmark, UG mark, FPO mark, ISI mark. All these marks are actually printed on the commodity and used for better marketing. What is the significance of this? Usually when you have this kind of certification from recognized government authority, it means it is a good quality product, and it is definitely going to help the product in charging more because of the quality assurance. Now for this you need certain labs across the country, and small companies, especially from MSME sector, might find it very difficult to afford or find good quality labs in their vicinity, or they might have to travel a long distance. In order to solve this problem, Government of India decided to map all the recognized laboratories in a particular area and tag them, geotag them through geographical information systems, and put it on a portal. That portal is nothing but PARAK, a unified laboratory network. So this includes 477 BIS empaneled and recognized laboratories. These labs are actually recognized by important organizations like FSSAI for food safety, EPEDA for agricultural products export, and CSIR, which gives the rating for the safety protocols and standard protocols followed by various laboratories. So it will definitely improve the export competitiveness of our products. The second part of the chapter is talking about the infrastructure. Now, what is infrastructure and why is it important in an economy? We have discussed in the National Monetization Pipeline video, but I'll briefly sum it up again. You can also watch that video. I'll be putting it in the description box. Now, simply put, infrastructure will help the economy. How? Firstly, since the government itself is encouraging the industry and also investing its own money to infrastructure sector, it will crowd in investments into this specific area. Secondly, infrastructure means we are creating long-term assets which can be used or monetized to create a multiplier effect and thereby improve our economy. How? Let's say, for example, in a rural area, a specific industry does not have a proper road to take their produce to a town. This is definitely going to be a roadblock for improvement of this industry. Once that road is laid down, that business will pick up and more industries might come into those areas. This is nothing but the multiplier effect. The money X which we invest in infrastructure would become 10x because of the effect it has on other sectors of the economy. Thirdly, we will all have positive externalities. Let's say, for example, if we have good infrastructure, it is going to be a positive value and increases the credit worthiness of the nation. More cheaper loans would come to our nation, and therefore it will also have positive impact on our GDP growth and positive externalities. So all this was discussed briefly. Now, it is because of this reason India wants to focus on infrastructure to create this multiplier effect. How? Let us understand. There are three sectors in our economy: primary, secondary, and tertiary. For all the sectors, the prerequisite is infrastructure. So, government has identified through a program called the National Infrastructure Pipeline certain areas which can have this multiplier effect, and identified that there are certain sectors where government should invest money or encourage investments into this sector. And out of those, energy, road, urban infrastructure and railways together constitute 70%, 72% of the entire amount that would be dedicated for this purpose. The second question is, how can the government bring in this much amount of money in the short term? If you remember, the reason for all this has been the aspiration to create a 5 trillion economy by 2025. This has been the aspiration of the government before 2020. That is before the COVID pandemic struck our economy. Now, it is a different thing that RBI has said that it would take nearly 13 years for India to see the recovery of losses that we faced during the time of COVID. But this agenda should continue. How is the question? Now, here is where government has come up with a very innovative program to create this sources of finance. One, we have the central contribution. Center, states, private parties will definitely contribute to this. But the most important point that we have to note is how the government is using this new concept of national monetization pipeline to create new sources of finance. Now, as far as this NIP, that is the National Infrastructure Pipeline, is concerned, the government declared that they will invest 111.2 lakh crore rupees into the infrastructure sector. And out of that, nearly 6 lakh crores would be coming from this new model called the National Monetization Pipeline. And for this, the government is creating a roadmap. Now, let us understand this concept. If we have to categorize infrastructure, we can do that on the basis of how the public is associated with that specific piece of infrastructure. Core infrastructure is where directly public will use that, and non-core is directly public can't use that. Let's say, for example, a state legislative assembly building or a government office. It is not for public use. Contrast that with, let's say, a railway station or a public park. This is for direct public use. So, brownfield core infrastructure means that infrastructure which is already existing, but probably it might be in a bad condition. But when you talk about greenfield, it is completely built from scratch by different sources of finance. Now, let us take this example of National Monetization Pipeline, a brownfield core sector. Let's say a airport or a railway station or a public park. This is given in a sort of a lease to a private sector. Now, private sector will repair it, and let's say if it is a public park, it will impose a fee of 50 rupees for entry. According to the contract and according to this concept of NMP, let's say the private party can keep with itself 40 rupees and give 10 rupees to the government, because it is giving this public space to that private party. So, this 10 rupees will again be reinvested into infrastructure towards creation of that assets under the National Infrastructure Pipeline. So, this is how National Monetization Plan would work. Now, what are the important areas or the important core areas where government wants to implement this National Monetization Pipeline? These are the sectors. So, like we have already discussed, 6 lakh crores out of the 111 lakh crores that the government would be spending towards the National Infrastructure Pipeline, they would be coming from these sectors. Almost 81% of this 6 lakh crores would be coming from these sectors: road, rail, power, oil and gas, and telecom. Out of that, roads constitute nearly 27%. Now, imagine, since all of these are handled by different ministries, it's quite possible that you might have a trouble in coordination. Now, what would you do? The logical point that one has to say is, We want to create a system where there is minimal miscommunication. So this PM Gati Shakti plan is that governance plan. It has nothing to do with economics. Don't confuse it with National Infrastructure Pipeline or the National Monetization Pipeline. If we specifically arrange this, India wants to create infrastructure. To create that infrastructure, we need a plan. That is the National Infrastructure Pipeline. Now, how do we finance that? That is given by NMP along with center, states, and private. Now, after we get this money, how to implement it? Implementation is nothing but project management. We need a plan for that, right? That plan is the PM Gati Shakti master plan. Now, if you have to explain it with something that we see on a regular basis, just for example, let's say there are two departments within a city. Drainage system is handled by one department and roads are handled by another department. If this department freshly lays down roads and then the drainage department sees that there is a need to repair a drainage and digs this new road, it's a criminal wastage of money. This lack of coordination is quite seen not just at the local level but also in big projects. Let's say, for example, environmental projects at national level also. To avoid such kind of ambiguities, this PM Gati Shakti master plan is going to help the ministries involved. Under the transportation sector, let us have a look at various segments. The first one is roadways. In the year 2000, our Prime Minister Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee initiated a scheme called the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. Basically, it's about construction of all-weather roads. Now, if we take a look at the trend from 2000 to 2013, which is the phase 1 of this, and then phase 2 is from 2013 to 19, and in third phase, that is in 2019, we started focusing on connecting important areas in rural areas like Gramin markets. This is just one example. It is not important to remember all the criteria laid down in this, but the target is to reach out to maximum possible areas. Up to 1.25 lakh kilometers of roadways are expected to be laid down by 2025, connecting this strategically important rural areas. If you notice the trend, over a period of time, this length of roads increased because of increased government expenditure. So these are the points that you have to remember. Other segment after rural roads is the national highways part, where a important scheme called the Bharatmala project is important to know for our exam. So this national highways construction focused on important economic corridors, border areas, and northeast region. Two phases were there, and the first one did not reach its target mainly because the land acquisition is a big issue. We know that land is actually a state subject. Apart from this, there are also cost overruns and delays due to COVID. Another important point with respect to this Gram Sadak Yojana in the third phase is the usage of green technology like cold mix asphalt. Basically, we are trying to reduce the carbon footprint while we are constructing these roads. When we are talking about the railways segment, the major problem is major money comes from freight movement, but because of the focus on passengers, freight did not get the right kind of attention it deserves. So as per the national rail plan by the government, we want to include the priority to the freight sector so as to increase the share of movement of goods from the present 27% to almost 45 to 50%. And within this national rail plan, we also have some short term targets in the form of Vision 2024, that is 100% electrification of all the lines and phase out the usage of fossil based engines. And secondly, we have to increase the average speed of all the trains. The third segment that we have to talk about is the aviation industry, which has taken a bad hit in the pandemic because of the lockdowns. So the focus of the central government has been to make air travel affordable. For this, they focused on regional connectivity and subsidized airlines to ensure that certain underserved and underconnected areas are given due attention by these airlines. And you also have to remember that within the scope of UDAN, which has been the traditional scheme and it has been in use for a very long time, only financial incentive is not the mode in which they want to support the airlines. They also want to involve them in the revival of infrastructure. And there were various phases, Udan 1.0, 2.0, so on and so forth. But we have to remember that Udan 5.0 is what we are at right now. And in Udan 3.0, an important aspect is the introduction of even seaplanes and the emphasis on tourist sectors. Just remember these points. And also, what happened in Udan 4.0 is inaccessible areas like northeast region and the islands of Lakshadweep were given due importance. And the Udan 4.1 version focused on smaller airports, new helicopter strips, and even seaplane services were further expanded. And the Ministry of Civil Aviation also placed heavy emphasis because of the importance of this growing sector, drone sector. So drone rules came into the picture, and you can see here the various definitions of what constitutes nano drones or micro drones and the other categories. So there is a necessity of a unique identification number, and the permission should be sought out from the regional authorities for the permission to use this kind of micro drones, because they can be used for other purposes and cause a national security threat as well. Other important development is, ever since 2017-18, Indian government has been trying to come out of this loss making entity of Air India that was eventually sold out to Tatas for 18,000 crores. And the next important segment is ports. In India, we know that there are 13 major ports and 205 minor ports. 13 major ports are dealt by special purpose vehicles created by the central government for this purpose, and minor ports are handled by state governments. And as far as these ports are concerned, the major issue is the turnaround time. What do you mean by this turnaround time? Now, let's say one ship went from India to a place in Africa, and it took roughly around 50 hours to go there and then come back. It needs a resting time. So how much time will a ship rest in a particular place will determine its efficiency. So the average time taken to rest is 56 hours, which is decent from the times that we were having before. But the problem is, this is not the problem. This was a problem previously, the turnaround time. But right now the problem is the cost involved. Most of the maritime trade in India goes to the foreign companies because of their cost effectiveness. If you take a look at the volume, 95% of the volume and 70% of value of Indian merchandise exports and imports comes through this maritime route only. So if we can actually work on reducing the export competitiveness, first thing that we have to do is focus on reducing the cost of this shipping. That is how the shipping industry in India will become competitive on a global level. This cost of shipping is very high. So the government, in order to support any government commodity or companies which are involved in trade at a government level, so the government has been insisting that shipping is done only through Indian companies. But this is not a sustainable way of increasing the competitiveness. Therefore, in order to encourage more companies here, 100% FDI has been introduced by Indian government. Apart from this, we also started this Sagarmala scheme, which is nothing but a port-led development. The problem is, at port areas, coastal economic zones are not created. An integrated format where economy becomes a way of life in these areas. So this has been missing for a very long time. Indian government wants to tap in and create those cities, small clusters around the ports where the cost of logistics significantly comes down. People reside in those areas for their livelihoods, develop their own skills, and therefore create a export hub. When we talk about transport on water, we only focus on seas and oceans, but we often ignore this inland waterways, that is rivers, lakes, etc., as a mode of transport from one area to another. This is not only cost effective but also environmentally sustainable. But the problem is, when boats from one river or one state wants to move to the other states, there has been a major issue in Inland Vessel Act previously. That was amended in 2021 with a clear regulation on what is the jurisdiction of different states. Thus, it is believed that MSME sector, which often wants to cut down its costs, will benefit significantly from this move. Next comes the telecom sector, which is the pillar of Digital India campaign, because 45% of the subscriptions of telecom are in rural areas, and urban consumers constitute 55% of the entire telecom subscribers. And from 2015 to 2021, we have seen almost 2x growth in the number of subscribers. Previously, there was this project called BharatNet project, which was previously called the National Optical Fiber Network in 2011, which was renamed as BharatNet. So the objective is very simple: to connect 2.5 lakh gram panchayats with internet. Various phases happened, and in the first and second phases, there was no public-private partnership, but the government recognized the need for involvement of the private sector, and in the third phase, we now have a public-private partnership model to extend this objective of internet to the gram panchayats. This is what you have to know. The next aspect that we have to know about is the power sector. This is the screenshot taken from the Power Ministry's website directly, and you can see that 399 gigawatts, or almost you can say 400 gigawatts, is the power generation capacity in our country. In 2001, there was a question asked about the amount of power generated in our economy back then. It was 95 gigawatt. You can imagine the significant growth in our capacity in the last 20 years. But that is not sufficient. If you take a look at the Panchamrit strategy or the commitments that India made towards environment in COP26 or the Glasgow summit, is that by 2030, India would be meeting 50% of its needs through renewable energy. And that 50% constitutes 500 gigawatt. So we are almost on the path to reach out for 1000 gigawatt energy. And as far as the breakup of the various sources of power is concerned, it's quite evident that coal is contributing to more than 50% of our power generation. That is why we cannot phase out coal so easily at this point of time. And overall, nearly 60%. These statistics are from March 2022. So these are the latest statistics. So 60% of the power comes from fossil fuels only, and non-fossil fuels contribute to the rest, roughly around 39.2%. Other percentage includes 1.7% of nuclear energy. So the total capacity you can see is 400 gigawatt. Now, within the renewable energy sector, you see that solar is the highest, and it is growing at a very tremendous pace. So if we have to meet this objective of 500 gigawatts of renewable energy, it is possible only if we focus on integrating these renewable energy sources to the national grid and focus on more generation which is sustainable and also meets the demand of that particular point of time. So the bottom line in this journey towards net zero carbon, that is whatever carbon emissions that we are emitting will be absorbed back. This transition to clean fuel should also be backed by the fact that we have to diversify our sources. We should not put all our eggs in a single basket. Let's say if we want to go towards that renewable energy, we should not focus completely on solar or completely on wind. Wherever possible, according to the geography of that region and the climatic conditions, we have to tap into those resources and diversify. But at the same time, if India wants to move towards storage technology, like say for example lithium ion batteries and other sources of alternative fuels, they require a lot of raw materials like nickel, cobalt or lithium, which would be very expensive in the coming days, considering the fact that we are all moving towards net zero carbon. So India, if adopted early, will have this early mover advantage. This brings us to the conclusion of our economy crash course and economy series. So what is left over now is agriculture and environment topics from economic survey, along with the various schemes which are mentioned in the economic survey. This will be covered in a separate series. I hope you found this economy crash course series very useful. That's it from my side. Thank you, and I wish you all the best for your prelims examination.